Good morning from Fredericksburg. I'm out here at the wall in front of it where the sunken road is right behind that wall behind me here. And it's early morning time out here. And I wanted to come out here and just kind of get a feeling for what it's like. And I'm going to go up to the cemetery here in a minute and talk a little bit about some of the people that are buried up there at that cemetery and maybe get some good shots of the sunrise while I'm up there. So let's go. It was great catching the sunrise up here on the National Cemetery at the Hill here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. However, when the sun rose December 14th of 1863, it wasn't so great for some soldiers. There was one account of a soldier that had gone inside a building in downtown Fredericksburg, and they had fallen asleep while they were in there. Their unit, however, had made its way back across the river at some point in time. And I'm not real sure what the date on this is, but it was from a letter from a soldier that was written on the 21st of December. He woke to find himself alone. So he had a choice. He was going to have to try to make his way back across that river and see if he could get to his comrades on the other side, or he was going to have to be taken captive by the Confederate soldiers. So he chose to try to make his way across. But then he realized there were no pontoon boats, there were no structures for him to walk across simply to the other side. But somehow, this soldier managed to get himself back to the other side, only to be detailed a few days later under a flag of truce to come across and pick up his comrades' bodies and bury them and try to mark them for identification. One of his friends was named Augustus, and he wrote back home and he told his mother that one of his friends had been killed the day before. His friend was on the other side of a fence, a wooden fence, when a cannonball came through. The cannonball hit his leg, and he described it to his mother, saying that it had hit his leg and ripped it off all the way up next to the body, and it was hanging on simply by a thread of skin. They had bound up the wound as tightly as they could, but he only lived for a short while after, because obviously the loss of blood was too much and the young man died. So he had to take his friend's frozen body and place it in a shallow grave somewhere out here and marked it so that the family of that man could come back out and find his body. It's stories like that that'll run your blood cold and give you a real picture of what this place is all about. There's lots of tales of glory and heroism and things like that to make people want to come out here and visit it, based on fairy tales and book stories. But this battle was no fairy tale. The fight that happened out here was no tale straight out of Camelot. This was combat. There were a lot of men out here that died. They died alone. They died without their families. And they died in a bloody mess. So when you visit places like this, here at Fredericksburg and other battlefields around the country, you have to understand, you're not just dealing with a storybook, a fairy tale. You're dealing with combat. You're dealing with death and destruction. And behind me, these are the people that understand what it's all about. And they're not here anymore. Directly behind me here is a monument that is probably most recognized here in the cemetery at Fredericksburg. The monument is to Major General Humphreys, whose division actually attacked out here at the sunken road, or attempted to attack this position. In 1908, it was erected out here and was moved to this current location here, and it kind of looks like the centerpiece now of this cemetery, although at the time it was not considered to be the centerpiece of the cemetery itself. Buried directly behind me here is a man by the name of Townsend. He was a sergeant in the 25th New Jersey. This would be his first actual assault, his first battle up here at Fredericksburg. He had joined for just a short period of time, and it was speculated that the reason why was because he was trying to get back home in time with his girlfriend so that he could marry her. He did his training up in Washington and was with the 9th Corps of Ambrose Burnside. Eventually, they would make their way up here right around December 8th. Townsend would come across that river and would take part in the assault here. And that same day, he would die. This would be his first and his only time in combat. Now, I know my trip's usually all about the battles that took place where they're at, but I have a very significant person buried behind me here. Edith Tench grew up here at Fredericksburg on Caroline Street. And in 1917, she decided right after she was married that she was going to become a veteran of the United States Navy. So she joined the Navy and the Navy Reserves as a yeoman. And she enlisted and served during World War I. She eventually would complete her service and leave the Navy, but unfortunately she would die of kidney failure and kidney disease later on. Her brother is actually buried here in this cemetery also, and it's the only case of a brother and sister being buried here at Fredericksburg in the cemetery together. Kind of going with a little bit of what I did earlier. Admiral L. Jett was a veteran of World War I. He's actually buried out here at this National Cemetery in Fredericksburg, which started off as a cemetery for Union veterans of the American Civil War, but at one point other soldiers were allowed to be buried here. Interesting about this particular grave, his son also fought, but fought in World War II in the United States Marine Corps. Admiral G. Jett was at Iwo Jima, and he deliberately exposed himself to draw enemy fire after calling back directions that enabled his fellow soldiers to knock out the guns. But at the request of his family, he was buried here in the same grave as his father. On the other side of this grave is the inscription of his name. The last soldier to be buried in this cemetery is the son of Admiral L. Jett, and he has that distinction. Both of them combat veterans of World War I and World War II. Now for a case of mistaken identity. Buried in that grave right there, 3867 here at Fredericksburg, Virginia, is a man by the last name of Grant. He was found at McCool's farm, at the Battle of McCool's farm, and had died there. And in the confusion of the fighting and the dead men that were laying on the field, it was thought that he was with the 58th Pennsylvania. And it turns out that they weren't even in the fight there. and as a matter of fact, it was the 58th Virginia. So these cemeteries, they were built and put together by the United States government for United States soldiers. Confederate soldiers were considered traitors. They were not to be buried in these cemeteries. And for a long time after the war, many Confederate cemeteries started to pop up around the towns in the South because they did not have places to bury their dead other than family plots. So they would create these Confederate burial cemeteries for the mass graves of soldiers that were unidentified on the battlefields in and around Virginia. This young man here snuck into this cemetery here at Fredericksburg and was buried as a Union soldier. However, he is a Confederate soldier. And there are upwards of around 3 other soldiers that are buried here at Fredericksburg with similar stories of being mistaken for Union veterans when in fact they are Confederate veterans that are buried here in a United States soldiers cemetery. Directly behind me here is a monument to the 5th Corps, who lost a little over 2,000 men here at the Battle of Fredericksburg. This monument was placed in 1900, and because Butterfield couldn't make it, Edward Hill came out here to dedicate this monument and speak for the crowd. While Edward Hill was here dedicating this monument, he declared that he be buried here, right by this monument. This is where he wanted to be buried. And so Edward Hill becomes one of a couple of Medal of Honor recipients buried here in the cemetery at Fredericksburg National Cemetery. And he is in fact buried right here next to the monument, just one person over. His headstone is flat on the ground. It's not an upright headstone, and I'll show you here in just a second. Walking down from this national cemetery, it's very easy to see why it is that many people come here. They come here for the peace, the tranquility, but also the remembrance. Many soldiers would come back to these graves, these cemeteries, to visit their comrades that had died. A lot of them not knowing where some of them were buried, but they knew exactly where they fell. It's been a pleasure taking you through the cemetery today and highlighting some of the stories here at Fredericksburg. I hope you take something back from it and share it along with all your friends. If you like these stories, if you like this video, click subscribe. Keep me going. Till next time, this is History with Waffles.